With his terrific podcast, American Radical, our friend and colleague, Ayman Mohideen, showed all of us that a descent into disinformation and conspiracy theories can happen lightning quick and sometimes totally out of nowhere. Our reflections on January 6th this week ought to include that among the most tragic consequences of Donald Trump's big lie is what it did to people you might otherwise have considered totally normal. Consider this from the president of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, quote, of the 727 people arrested because of their actions on January 6, about 155, or nearly a quarter, had ties to a wide range of right-wing extremist groups and ideologies, including the Proud Boys, anti-government, Oath Keepers, QAnon, and white supremacists. Perhaps more alarming, however, 79% of those arrested had no explicit ties to extremist movements or groups. This suggests that a significant number of seemingly ordinary Americans decided that mob violence was an appropriate response to the election results. Joining us now is Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, as well as the author of a tremendous new book, It Could Happen Here, Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable, and How We Can Stop It. And Rick Stengel is also with us, a former top State Department official, now an MSNBC analyst. Jonathan, I want you to tell me the story of Damian Patton, but I want you first to tell me, your title and Congressman Jamie Raskin's title are both about unthinkable. How are we now just sort of sitting in the deep end of that which was not so long ago unthinkable?
Yeah, it is interesting that both Congressman Raskin and my books are coming out at the same time with essentially the same title, which just shows you how far we have moved, Nicole, and I think it's rather frightening. I mean, look, in the last 5 years, since the advent of Trumpism, if you will, we have seen the normalization of extremism. We have seen an acceleration of intolerance. We have seen the spread of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and hate crimes that we never would have imagined. Now, to be clear, extremism existed before Donald Trump. He didn't invent it. Quite the contrary. What he did was weaponize it and turn prejudice into a political weapon that was very effective for him. So today, I think what we're looking at is, again, anti-Semitism has been amplified. We have nearly double the number of incidents today than we did just a few years ago. Hate crimes increased 12% in 2020, according to the FBI. And it feels like those numbers that you shared at the top, 4 out of 5 of the people who staged a terror attack, because that's what I would call January 6th, the most predictable terror attack in American history, because they told us what they were going to do, weren't members of the equivalent of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They were ordinary people who were radicalized. And that requires us to consider, how can we employ a whole of society strategy to tackle this problem of domestic terrorism and amplified extremism and illiberalism once and for all?
Well, how do you do it with all of the, I think, treasured protections of a First Amendment right of free speech and association? How do you do it when the threat is so interconnected and braided into the most prominent figure in the American right now, Donald Trump?
It's a great question. I guess what I would say is that, as an organization, the ADL, we're the oldest anti-hate group in the United States. We've been fighting for the First Amendment and for our freedoms for more than 100 years. And we've always pushed back on extremists since the KKK and Nazi sympathizers and whatnot. And frankly, hearing hard speech is part of the price of the First Amendment. And there will always be a lunatic fringe. But, Nicole, we've got to keep them on the fringe. And we don't need to privilege prejudice as if it were something to be validated with, primetime appearances. Social media, for the first time in a long time, did the right thing in taking Trump off of Facebook, off of Twitter, off of YouTube, because let's be clear. Freedom of expression is not the freedom to incite violence. And you may be the president, or you may be kind of a public figure like Alex Jones, the pseudo-journalist performer that he is, but you have no right to show up on social media if you're going to slander people. That isn't protected speech. And I applaud those networks who, just like, you choose not to have white supremacists on your airtime, choosing not to display this madness is actually, I think, part of our shared civic duty. And we need to do more of it, not allow the bad guys to weaponize the First Amendment and hide behind it.
Do you feel, though, like civic duty doesn't mean the same thing to the country at large anymore? You've got 40% of Americans who think civic duty means marching on the Capitol to, quote, hang Mike Pence.
Yeah, it is a scary moment in history when indeed you have ordinary Americans who want to lynch the vice president, who broke into the Capitol with the intent to capture and kill elected members of Congress, let alone the vice president. Oh, and by the way, a year later, the Washington Post poll earlier this week, more than 30% of Americans think violence is okay against the government. I mean, this is really without precedent. And yet I will say there are ways to stop this madness. I mean, literally, that's why I wrote the book, Nicole, because I share sort of our strategy. Pardon?
I want to ask you about the book. There's some incredible storytelling in the book that does take this conversation into how do we fix it. And I want to bring Rick Stengel into it as well, who has written a great book of his own about disinformation. So I want to ask both of you to stick around through a break, and let's put those pieces together and talk about how we start to fix it. We're back with Jonathan and Rick. Jonathan, to your book, tell the story of Damian Patton.
Damian Patton's really an extraordinary man. He was born to a Jewish family in Southern California, broken home, got involved in gangs, and then bizarrely got involved with the white supremacy movement, suppressed his Jewish identity, hid it entirely, and was radicalized, essentially, if you will. Ended up in Tennessee, where he was involved in a crime where they shot up a synagogue. He was a minor, so while the other two men in the car were arrested, Damian was let off. This was, dismissed, this case for him, and yet he went on to join the military, get involved in NASCAR, and eventually got involved in tech and started a very successful software company. And yet about a year and a half ago, it was revealed, some investigative reporter discovered that earlier in his life, he'd been a white supremacist. When this news came clear, even though for 20-some odd years he'd done nothing in the white supremacy movement, he'd actually given to Jewish causes. He was outed. He was sort of canceled, despite his apologies and whatnot, fired from the company he founded, and then left to spend the next year in a process of sort of introspection, reflection, and ultimately redemption. I got to know him when he started this process through a mutual friend, a venture capitalist, and I've worked with him over the past year, watched him come around, and his story gives me hope. His story is remarkable about how a person can amend for their sins and be redeemed. And I think in this moment today, I wish more on the extreme right and even some on the far left would remember that we all can be redeemed. We just have the power to accept responsibility for our errors and look ahead.
Rick, it's such an important conversation. And cable news doesn't do a good enough job of showcasing the nuances here. I mean, you cannot write off the 40% of the country that believes in the extremist views of the ex-president. You just can't. There's too many of them. And this idea of redemption is an interesting one to lay over the January 6th anniversary. What are your thoughts today?
Well, first, Nicole, I want to congratulate Jonathan on his book. It's an incredibly important subject, and his day job is incredibly important as well. So congratulations on that. No, you can't write off 40% of Americans. We're a democracy. They're significant. And the thing is, I think what people don't understand always is that disinformation doesn't radicalize people. It's a gateway. It's not a gateway drug. People are radicalized much more, and we saw this with ISIS when I was in the State Department, much more by an epidemiological model, by people that they know already, by intimates. I mean, you were talking about the Oath Keepers and these illegal militia groups. Well, there's a reason why the people in them are brothers and cousins, because they radicalize each other. The disinformation and the conspiracy theories it increases enthusiasm. It's a kind of a force multiplier, but it doesn't actually create radicals from the get-go. And I think we have to realize that. But I think, and I've been on the disinformation front for a while, and I'm a little disheartened because it's not very easy to counter disinformation. I actually think the only thing we can do is try to overwhelm it with fact-based information, with truth. Because you and I know, we all know the experience of trying to argue with someone who's a conspiracy theorist. It makes them even more convinced that they're right. So it's not about countering disinformation, which is often counterproductive. It's about creating truthful, true information and hopefully letting people redeem themselves.
Well, the opposite happened at the 8 o'clock hour on Fox News with Ted Cruz and trying to put the truth back in the toothpaste and be part of the conspiracy. So we have a lot of work to do. I'd like to put you both on the spot for a 2022 project of having this conversation where we focus not on the most outrageous sort of consumption of disinformation or distribution of it, but how we fix it. And I hope that's something we can do here in these hours. And I won't say I hate putting people on the spot on live TV because sometimes it's effective, but I apologize in advance for having done so. We will continue to call on both of you. The book is called It Could Happen Here. It's out now. Jonathan Greenblatt and Rick Stengel, thank you so much to both of you.